I've got a brief presentation to go through before we do the panel session. And in the presentation, we've taken some data from the Extel study this year, looking at what's happening in investor relations in terms of Russia, and also what's happening in terms of investor relations, comparing that with pan-Euro. And really, I won't spend too long. I've tried to make this quite a visual presentation. Having said that, the first slide is all words. But there are really, what I want to do is set the context of what we see as the sort of some of the key themes in investor relations, and then illustrate some of those themes against some of the slides that follow. In terms of the key themes, I'd say really they sort of boil. There are a number of things there which cover really four areas. We all know IR is becoming and it continues to become more professional. Definite fact, and you see that in lots of ways. That has implications in terms of more work, more resources as well, but it's certainly become more professional. The buy side has become more selective, and buy side appetites and the way that the buy side is interacting with the market is changing, and that continues to impact on investor relations quite obviously, driven partially by the buy side themselves, partially by regulation. The sell side too is changing. Probably not in such a good way. The sell side is declining, quite definitely. Not going to disappear by any manner of means, but it is declining, and that has a real impact, I think, in terms of the work that IR has to do and the way that IR has to operate. And out of all of this, what it does end up with is that excellence and long-term excellence in investor relations is more difficult to achieve because it is more professional. The requirements of the buy side are more complex. The challenge in terms of taking up some of the areas that used to be dealt with by the sell side make IR more complex. But we do see, and because we in Extel have covered investor relations across Europe for some 15, 16 years now, we have such a long trend of data that we can look at. We definitely see that long-term excellence in investor relations adds to the multiple of the stock price. Most times when I meet with IR people, everybody would be quite anxious to say that what I get paid, my bonus is not related to the stock price. On the short term, of course, that's absolutely right. But the IR in the long term has got to be about the stock price. What else is it about? And building real trust and real confidence with the market, which we see is reflected in consistent year-on-year high rankings in Extel, that will feed through, and I can show you the data whenever you want to look at it. That feeds through to outperformance in terms of stock price. All right, having said that, let's move to some more visualizations. Overall, this slide says that if I was to show you that slide 3 years ago, the difference is greater. So IR in Russia is improving, but in terms of the view from the buy side and sell side, and this is a combined view from them both, in terms of the quality of one-on-ones or roadshows or whatever it is, you can see the averages for Russian companies lag behind pan-Euro. I'm sure there are instances in this room where the gap is non-existent, or indeed the other way, but overall there is still this gap. Is that surprising? I wouldn't say it was really. Investor relations as a profession really began in the USA. As with most American things, went to the UK first before it came to Europe, and then spread elsewhere. So Russia has not been doing IR as long as the UK or as Germany, let alone the US. As an aside, I don't personally think the US does investor relations that well. There are instances where it does it very well, but in general, I'm not sure it does it that well. But anyway, across Europe, there is work to do for Russian companies in terms of improving virtually on all aspects of investor relations. Right. Is that the next one? It is the next one. Quite a bit of what I want to talk about here in terms of one of the key things that we see that the buy side in particular, sell side to a lesser extent, but particularly the buy side want, is greater access to CEO CFO. And this first chart doesn't look too bad from a Russian perspective. This is views from Russian companies, and comparing it obviously with pan-Euro. In total, about 960 pan-European companies took part. It is showing how much of CEO, CFO time is available to IR for meetings with either prospective, current or former investors. And okay, Russia puts more focus on meeting with top 20 investors than on prospective and former, a greater sort of differential there. But there's not a huge amount of difference there. But bear in mind that overall the amount of time that is available from Russian companies in terms of CEO and CFO involvement is not as high as the market wants, and the market wants more. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Just before we do that, just as a sort of aside, we'll get this thing to work. All right. One of the other problems I think the Russian companies face is a very wide remit in terms of investor relations. Again, as you can see, this is views from corporates in terms of what the IR team actually does. And again, I think quite often for some historic reasons as much as anything else, Russian companies or Russian IR teams, as you can see, tend to be more actively involved in virtually everything there than European companies overall. That really does, I think, present a problem going forward because it makes the specialization of IR more of a challenge. And it also, against this overall backdrop of IR having more things to do because of the changing appetite of the buy side and the declining influence of the sell side, if IR has got to deal with those external factors and at the same time has to do more on all of these types of things, then I think that is a challenge for IR. In a way, it's good that investor relations is so widespread. I think we all know, everybody here who's involved in IR, I think one of the attractions for anybody in IR is that it is a very wide-ranging role. You get involved in a lot of different aspects of the company, but there are limits. You know, there's only 24 hours in the day, and so there's limits to what you can achieve and how much you can achieve. And given that, I think those wide responsibilities do present a challenge for Russian IR. And sort of, I just put this in a little bit of a side, but it sort of relates to it in terms of the involvement of social media. On one level, this looks bad, doesn't it? That, okay, most of Europe, the majority of European companies have now got a clear policy in place in terms of what they're doing about social media, and Russian companies are still trying to work out how to spell Twitter. However, I think it doesn't matter at all. We've been covering and asking this question now for about 5 years. In terms of the importance, and surely everybody would start to do all their investor relations on YouTube or via some social media. It really is not happening. I think it might happen in the future when people really start to work out how they might be able to leverage those technologies and those distribution platforms in an intelligent fashion. But at the moment, it's not something that's really happening, and we do not see much interest from the buy or the sell side community in using social media as a way to really conduct analysis on companies, or from companies really using social media as a insightful way to communicate any IR messages. So the fact that you and Russia have chosen really from this data not to bother to put a policy in place sounds like just being sensible, to be frank. Right. Eventually this might work.
Следующий слайд, Никита, можно?
Yeah. There we go. Okay. So back to meetings with investors in terms of the involvement of CEO, CFO. I think the graph there, okay, so the orange and then the blue numbers, the blue colors are showing more meetings. So CEO, CFO meetings, clearly Russian companies are doing less than Pan-Euro as a whole. In compensation for that, IR only are doing more. Divisional directors, less. Well, so it's not so bad on the divisional side. But again, it isn't as many. That really does matter. There is no active equity fund manager that I have ever met who will take anything like a decent stake in a stock without having met CEO and CFO. There is an increasing appetite for meetings with divisional directors. In those meetings with divisional directors, the overall sort of numbers we would have is about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 companies still more or less has a policy that they just don't want divisional directors to be involved. We know that's a big drain on IR time, the need to coach people, the fear that a director may go off message or not really understand what lies behind a question from investors is the reason for that. Most companies have sought to respond to it by dealing with it through capital market days or investor days, where obviously you can control the agenda, you can control the time more in terms of your time. There's more opportunity to coach the divisional directors. All well and good, but increasingly we see from the buy side the appetite to meet divisional directors on a more informal, individual basis. Companies that do that do tend to be the companies that rank higher in terms of how their investor relations is perceived. I think it's an increasing challenge, and one that yeah, okay, companies don't have to respond to it, but I think the companies that do are more likely to get a proper valuation of their stock and a better understanding from the buy side of where the value drivers are in the company. So, there we go. Okay, oops, now we've gone forward too. Right, okay. And this is looking at it from the other way around in terms of what the buy side actually want. And as you can see, two of the things we've already talked about: more access to CEO, CFO, divisional director access. And again, particularly in Russia, those are above the pan-European average. They're high, particularly access to CEO, CFO. But I think they're above the average for Russian companies because of the comparative lack of that provision to date. The other point that I would bring up, and I say this to everybody I meet, is this issue, the point about industry and sector insights. That is where we now start to play very much into the issues around the sell side. In the past, the buy side would have looked very much for the sell side to provide such analysis, such wider market context to whatever stock story they were looking at. Yes, they still will look to the sell side to do that, but not as much as before, and increasingly they look to IR to do it. That again is another demand on investor relations in terms of being able to, how many things can you do in the day? But being able to do that and do it properly is actually, in the data we have, is the single most important driver of the overall view that buy or sell side will have about a company in terms of investor relations. Yeah, everything else matters. The website matters, access to management matters, responsiveness matters, etc. But being able to speak with an IR team that is able to really talk openly, properly, cogently about what's happening to the sector and the market and the industry they're in is really valuable, particularly to the buy side. In part, I know that can be very frustrating because arguably, ever since the global financial crisis, the appetite on the buy side for more macro understanding of issues has grown, and so hence they particularly want to meet with any company who they feel can act as a proxy for a wider market issue, be it the industry or the country or whatever it is. And so that can then therefore be frustrating for you who want to tell your own stock story and spend 2 hours in the meeting telling them all about China. But it does really pay dividends, as I say, in terms of how the overall IR function is viewed. And the reason for that, I think, is twofold. Firstly, it gives the investors genuine confidence that you as a stock, or you as a company, actually understand the industry and the challenges that you face. Because everybody has competitors, everybody has peers, everybody has issues in the industry. If you're able to talk very intelligently about them, that shows that you as a company understand those issues and so therefore ought to be better placed to address them. Secondly, and even more importantly, it delivers trust as far as the investors are concerned. I think by definition you need to be at least polite about the competitors rather than trash them. But given that you speak openly about the market, then that really does build trust, because that shows that you're able to give a straightforward answer to questions, a straightforward analysis of what you see as the issues in the market, rather than just trying to spin your own story. And as we all know, fundamentally what you're trying to do in IR is develop trust with the industry. Okay. Skip on, there's about 4 more. Roadshows. So we just wanted to pick up on a couple of points here. Overall, when we look at where people are going on roadshows, European companies, London, far and away the #1 destination. No surprise there. So much money run out of London, of course. US East Coast, the #2 destination. I think within that, Boston, increasingly a lot more popular than New York because of the hedge fund long-only split between those two. and Germany the third. And we can see, from a Russian perspective, all right, the numbers are not quite the same, but there's not a huge amount of difference. What I don't show on here, deliberately trying to keep some of our data back, is when you then look at the next two popular markets, which are actually Canada and France, as far as in terms of roadshow destinations for pan-European companies. Pan-European companies are a long, long way ahead in terms of meeting investors in those markets than Russian companies are. Given that there's a decent commonality in the top three markets, it strikes me as somewhat odd, particularly in terms of those two other markets. There are a lot of buy-side firms in France, a lot of long-only firms, and Canada, of course, ever since the global financial crisis, has become an increasingly important financial centre, largely because their banks were largely unaffected by the GFC. And I would genuinely counsel that I think there are opportunities for Russian stocks with buy-side in both Canada and France that from our data are not being exploited in terms of a lack of meetings comparatively compared to pan-Euro as a whole. And now a couple of slides on corporate access, which from a British perspective has been a topic of big interest in the investment community for 3 or 4 years, but I think it is wider than just a British aspect, I assure you. Clearly, in the UK, the buy side are not meant to pay for corporate access unless they pay for it directly, and that has had some international ripples in terms of the way that corporate access is viewed. What has happened in the UK is nothing. There has been really no change in terms of the provision of access by the sell side, the consumption of access by the buy side. There are some buy side firms who pay directly to the sell side for that access they receive. When they're paying, in most cases they're paying a nominal amount of money rather than a genuine amount of money. Most buy side firms have taken the approach of what is called mixed usage under the various regulations, so paying for it as part of research because they still see it as part of the research offering. I think that is actually true in that is what the buy side think. They don't see corporate access as an entirely separate, distinct service that you can sort of switch on or switch off. They definitely see it very much as part of the research offering. Challenge is, of course, particularly in the UK, the regulator wouldn't necessarily agree with that, and in fact definitely wouldn't. Whether the regulator, particularly in the UK, particularly post-Brexit, and it'd be interesting to see what role the FCA has against the various European regulators, chooses to revisit that, who can say? What it does go on, though, is, and let's go to the next slide, it has had an impact in terms of how the sell side is operating, not in the fact that they stopped doing corporate access, they haven't, but they are certainly becoming somewhat more selective in the amount of access they're offering. They will continue to offer access either to very large companies or to companies that they would feel are sexy in the sense of they could generate some investment banking fees from in the future. Middle-sized companies, boring companies that are unlikely to come to the market or give them a big fat IB fee are potentially going to struggle much more for access. And of course, what we then see, and I think we've seen this particularly in the Russian market where, for a number of other reasons, Russian equities have become less attractive in the last few years, and some of the previous larger sell-side firms that thought that they had an ongoing business here have somewhat retrenched in terms of that. We're seeing, from a European perspective, but also particularly there for a Russian perspective, I think an increasing dissatisfaction or concern in terms of the quality of the roadshows being offered by the sell side, the quality of conferences, etc. And again, of course, that comes right back to yourselves in terms of, all right, IR can do more. And we all know that in most cases, I'm sure everybody in this room running an IR team could organise and do their own roadshows. You know who the buy side you are want to see. All right, there may be a few missing that the sell side could add for you, but you don't do it yourselves. You primarily do it for the brokers, and it's true here, but it's true in Germany, it's true in the UK, it's true anywhere, because the brokers, it's an ostensibly free service from the brokers, and because the logistics and time involved in actually doing it and organising it yourselves is a big drain on time. And even when you reach a company, I don't know, like Siemens, who has 2 people within their 12-strong IR team who are only responsible for essentially roadshow administration, they still use brokers in certain markets where they don't have the deep knowledge of that local market. They don't have the logistic support or experience in order to just run the roadshow in that market. So the brokers are going to continue to be involved, but you and I are going to be more and more involved, which I think generally leads on to the wider issue in terms of more intelligent investor targeting, which is a topic for another day rather than now. Okay. All right. And then just more or less in closing, before just a few words on Extel. IR team sizes, as you can see, between Europe and Russia, and in terms of the job split, pretty much the same. This data covers in total, I can't remember how many Russian companies, but overall it covers some 4,000 corporates. So you're bound to end up with a lot of one-man teams. But the thing I would say here, and I say every opportunity I can, is, these teams are definitely too small. Clearly, you're an audience that are likely to support that analogy or that claim, and it's more about CEO, CFO. Do they support it? But it seems to me increasingly implausible as the market changes, as the sell side retracts. The coverage when sell side are offering waterfront coverage is often with comparatively lower quality teams, just so they can claim that they still cover the transport sector or the auto sector or whatever it is. As the buy side have become much more selective in terms of the sell side firms they use, in terms of the desire to find different insights, and as the appetite on both sides is for more direct contact with corporates, you have so much more to do. You have to present all of this in a wider industry context. You have to get divisional directors more involved. You have to be able to speak at a strategic level. There is only so many hours in the day that people can do that. IR teams, I think, don't have to get to 50, 100 people, clearly not, but they have to increase in size to an extent in order to satisfactorily deliver the type of support, advice, and insights that the market want. All right, and then just finally, in terms of, so what are the buy side looking for from the brokers? And again, it's, okay, local market knowledge and insights and support is the number one thing, and we see that in this is an overall slide. When you look at it on different countries, we see it everywhere. But the second most important thing is management access. So, this just re-emphasizes the point that the buy side see that as very much as part of the service they get, and it's a really important service that is provided. And as the brokers will increasingly look at how they're providing that, and the buy side get more selective in terms of how they consume it, that is going to just put yet more resources, yet more demand on IR resources. All right. The rest of this is just talking about Extel this year, and I'm happy to talk to anybody subsequently about it rather than go through it in detail, because this is just saying how wonderful Extel is, which I know. The one point I would say, the participation really huge. Huge participation, over 1 million votes, nearly 20,000 people taking part. This is a massive set of data, it really is. Okay, and then we provide lots of other analysis that if you want, you can come and talk to me, and I'll happily sell it to you, of course. All right, thank you very much for your time.